Welcome back to Jon David's Journey, everybody. I've been asked for Jon David's testimony a couple times this week, and since he's a baby and too young to give it, I will, because people have asked how he's a miracle and how has he survived all this. And if you're wondering how is he a miracle, I'll just give you some ideas of what he's gone through in the first month of his life. So he had a brain hemorrhage when he was born. He has had cardiac arrest, VA ECMO life support, a stroke, a brain bleed, seizures, collapsed lung, and a pulmonary hemorrhage, among other things. Now, if you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot, but there's medical science and, those aren't miracles. I'm going to kind of explain some of the main ideas real quick before I get into his testimony. But I will say this, for me, people are like, how can you believe in Christianity? What proof is there? For me, there's two things that kind of work really well, because I do have more of a scientific mind. That's how I think. It's more logical and just rational and here. And so for me, when people are like, well, you can't see that, how do you know? And two things come, and these are like things that you can tangibly see and feel and science backs up. Okay. One being water. For those of you who don't know this, water is the only substance that becomes less dense when it's frozen than everything else. Also, water is our building block of life. If we don't have water, we don't have life. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. It is the very beginning of every food chain. We don't have water, there is no life on this planet, right? So what happens if water acted like everything else? If it was frozen and sunk down, there's no life anywhere, right? So everything's killed. The food chain's completely gone. We don't live. There's nothing. So that, plus the fact with the honeybee, which first of all, the honeybee is what we need in order to make all of our fruit and produce because it pollinates everything, right? So the honeybee defies the laws of physics. These two things break the natural order. There's a design to them because they are integral into how everything else works. To me, those are the little bitty details, the little bitty tidbits, the chance things that's where God works. Those are the miracles, right? So water, honeybees, people don't expect them to be miracles because they're everyday things. But if you look at them from a scientific point of view, they're miracles, right? What are the chances that those two things break the laws of everything else? And those two things just happen to be the things that literally make everything else work. Because without them, the entire system that we have in terms of life is just gone. It's ruined. Now, that being said, I also believe that God works in the chance areas of our lives, right? We have to pay attention. He gives us little nudges. For those of you who are on the world, football in America, soccer, I didn't grow up playing it. I actually played 4 years of American football in high school. I played world football, soccer, my senior year. And I went to college, didn't really play it there. Went and graduated from college. I'm a teacher, and went and applied for a job, interviewed, got offered the job. And when I got offered the job, I also got offered a position to coach football or women's soccer. And I was not really sure on whether or not I wanted to take the job. I was working at Staples, which is an office supply store. And there were about 15 of us working that day. This woman comes in while I'm restocking, and she asked for some corkboard. I helped her find it, showed her where it was. I turned around to leave, and something just told me let me go ask her what this is for. I'd already helped her. She already had it. She could have just left. I could have gone back to work. But I asked her, I said, do you mind me asking you what this corkboard's for? And she told me it was for a football camp or a soccer camp. Come to find out, this lady was a college football soccer player. She was not just a college football soccer player. She was the leading goal scorer for all colleges in the U.S., period. She's the record holder. She also was a coach at one of the local high schools and had won several state championships. So what are the chances of that, right? So I was unsure about where I was supposed to go, what I was supposed to do, if I should keep applying for more jobs and interviewing. And there's that chance right there that nudged me in the direction and has placed me where I am now. And I'm going to be very honest, from the time that I've gotten to where I live, which is where we are now, to now, I felt at home. I felt at peace. So for me, that's not necessarily like a huge miracle to you. It probably isn't a huge miracle, but that little bit, that told me that's where I'm supposed to be, right? So God works in those chance places. Also, when we're talking about like design, the heart is super complicated, but we're also very blessed, Mallory and I, to live in a time where these things can be fixed. And it's kind of like going back to the chances and blessings and things like that. It's kind of like the joke about the guy who's on the roof and the flood's coming and a boat comes by and says, "Hey, get in the boat. I'm here to pick you up and save you." And he says, "No, I've prayed and God's going to save me." And then, a helicopter comes by and they say, "Come on, we're going to save you." And he says, "No, no, no. I've prayed about it and God's going to save me." And then he drowns and gets to heaven and says, "God, why didn't you save me?" He's like, "I sent you a boat and a helicopter. What did you want me to do?" He sends those things, but we have to take advantage of them, right? And sorry for the ventilators going off with Jon David. It's got some water caught up in it, but it'll be turned off here in a second. Now, getting on to Jon David's testimony, which again is what I've been asked for this week. First of all, when we went to his first 8-week appointment, they could not find a yolk sac for Jon David. So we were told at that appointment that he would be a miscarriage, and told to come back and follow up the 10-week appointment because we did not want to terminate the pregnancy at that point, which we've never wanted to terminate this pregnancy, but that was one of the options that was on the table, and we said we would wait and we would come back for another appointment. So at the 10-week appointment, they were able to find what they thought was the yolk sac, but they weren't sure, so they gave us another 2-week appointment. Well, at the 12-week appointment, he seemed to be growing and doing well, and I believe at the 12-week appointment, we were told the yolk sac was irrelevant at that point. He was still there and things were fine. But at that appointment, we found out that he had a heart condition. We weren't sure what type of heart condition, but we knew it was going to be some type of heart condition. So then that was on a Tuesday. We also have a whole other story about Hunter, our firstborn, who got kicked in the face by a horse that Sunday before that. So that was a bad week, but it's not as bad as the week that I'm going to get to in Jon David's testimony. That was the second worst week of our lives. The top one is definitely what I'm getting to here in a little bit. But we go through the entire pregnancy. Jon David's born. He had a C-section. The plan was to be able to hold him for about 30 minutes before he came up here, but it was kind of at that point that we knew that he probably was not as good or well off as they had planned. He scored a 1 on the APGAR test, which if you know from having your own children or if you're a medical professional, you know that's not good. So they rushed him up to the pediatric intensive care unit and put him on a ventilator and got him settled and stable. Then the next day they did an MRI and found a brain hemorrhage, which delayed surgery for a few days. So for a few days everything was kind of all right. It was chill. But then Jon David also had some follow-up MRIs, and we don't know if it was that or if somehow he touched it and grabbed it, but somehow the ventilator tube, he messed it up and ended up self-extubating, which was the first kind of emergency that we had. And again, at that time we were like super emergency. It was staff assist. That wasn't the emergency. We'll get to the emergency in a little bit. But we went through that. They went ahead and extubated him. For 10 hours, he breathed on his own, but then he had fluid build up and had a collapsed lung, so they intubated him or put the tube back in for the ventilator, and he's been on a ventilator since. And then a couple days later, he had his first open heart surgery. So we were told, like, this is going to be fine. He's going to go through it. It'll be all right. We learned later on that it was a little bit bigger, but we were told the surgery was over. They called and gave us updates while it was going on. And then we had talked to some other families, and they kind of gave us an idea of like the time span of when the surgery ends versus when we could come back to the room and see him. And we were expecting this, and that's kind of what we were told. And then it started stretching and stretching and stretching. We started getting into these longer periods. And so we were like, okay, something's probably not right, because we kept asking, can we go back? Oh, they're not ready for you yet. They're not ready for you yet. So he had a really hard time stabilizing post-op. And really and truly, he never truly got to a point where he was like super stable. So they did eventually let us come back, and we were back here with him, but he wasn't doing all that well. They rounded that night, and they had not pulled his CAP drugs or his cardiac arrest prevention plan drugs. And so the nurse who was on duty said, hey, we haven't pulled these yet. I think we should pull these, right? And this is the first little chance thing for me. Like, this is where God was working in that chance period. So the nurse, his name is Matt, pulled the drugs. Within 30 minutes of him pulling the drugs, Jon David went to cardiac arrest. If he had not done that, if those things had not been prepared, then his CPR and his resuscitation would have been much, much more disastrous. I don't want to say disastrous, but disastrous. Like, it would have been worse, right? It would have had the chance of it being more disastrous than it was. Because I'm sorry, any parent who has their child go into cardiac arrest, that's a disaster. That is essentially worst case scenario. Your child is dying. So they pull the drugs, they do the CPR. We spent the night out in the conference room, essentially, because they had to call in the surgeons to do VA ECMO life support and put him on there. And he was on VA ECMO life support from March 4th until March 7th, like about 11:30 on March 4th until about lunchtime March 7th. And those were the longest 63 hours of my life. So that made the worst week, and that wasn't even the end of it. But those 63 hours, I really can't tell you a whole lot of what happened in those 63 hours because it's much, like, a lot of it's a blur. However, I can tell you that they felt like 10 years. Time drug. There was a lot of praying, there was a lot of crying, there was just a lot of emotions going on during that time. Now, he came off about lunchtime on March 7th. He was doing well, and we got back here. Moods were so much better. A lot of relief from everybody, the staff, from us. I mean, it was a tense time being on that life support because essentially you're on your most interventions at that point. You've maxed out your interventions. The next step is not what anybody wants to talk about or what anybody wants to realize with the newborn. So he's in here, everything's kind of going well, and then there had been a staff change about 7 p.m., which is when they have the new shift come in. And shortly after that, the new nurse, Emily, was in here with us, and we were talking, and she noticed that the wavelength started looking like this. And I said, I noticed it too. And I was like, what is that? Because she had a really puzzled look on her face. And she goes, I don't like that. And I was like, well, why don't you like that? What's wrong with it? She goes, that's indicative of a seizure. So they did an ultrasound. There was nothing on the ultrasound. There was no brain bleed. There was no proof of anything that had happened. So they ordered a CT scan and some EEG leads to be put on that night, which is where we met Tangi and Courtney, who are his EEG aunties forever now. And so they came in and were reassuring Mallory that everything was going to be fine, it was going to be okay. Well, the next morning they found out that he was having 6 seizures an hour through the night, and that they couldn't see him because he was on paralytic, so you couldn't physically see the seizures, but that's why they had the EEG leads and they could see them. And that he had had a stroke and a brain bleed. So that officially was the worst week of our lives. Cardiac arrest, life support, stroke, brain bleed. And then after that, they put him on some anti-epileptics to prevent the seizures. He went through a period where he finally got stable, but he had an open chest through this entire period. And so then the next hurdle was closing his chest. They tried the first time, and he was not tolerating it well. He was hitting back in the same direction. I mean, they looked almost identical of like the stats. I was standing in the corner watching through all this of where he was going. It looked like he was hitting back for another cardiac arrest. But if he had had another cardiac arrest, they would not have been able to use life support this time because he had the brain bleed. And in order to be on that type of life support, you need blood thinners. You can't have blood thinners when you have a brain bleed. It will allow you to keep bleeding more because your blood will not clot and stop the bleed, and then that leads to death. So they were like, yeah, we can't risk this if he's not tolerating it. So they opened his chest back up. A couple days later, they staged his chest closure into 2 parts, part 1 and part 2. And then he's tolerated it well. And so then after that, the next challenge was they started trying to feed him through trickle feeds through an NG tube in his nose. And he started desaturating and was intolerant of the feeds. And so then they had to increase his supports and put him on nitric. Luckily, after about 4 days, he came off nitric, and he's finally now on a more traditional recovery path. We're still taking baby steps. We're still slow. For those of y'all who've been watching on the daily updates, you know this. You know that we've now had 4 days in a row where he has taken baby step by baby step by baby step. We're moving more away from the more severe critical position that he's been in for a lot of his recovery time post-op. But what I want to say in terms of his testimony is that if Matt had not pulled those cap drugs, we would have a whole different conversation probably of what because one of the biggest things is how quickly you can get good CPR and the drugs in for the resuscitation and for the ECMO life support. Also, he was put on ECMO within 30 minutes. We had 3 surgeons show up when this call was made. They were all here within a few minutes. Also, if Emily had not picked up on the seizures and the stroke, and doing that part, I mean, who knows how long he would have bled and what the damage would have been if she had not caught that. To me, those are those chance areas. Those are those things where we've been given opportunities to recognize things, to see things, to take action. Just like there was a movie I watched when I was growing up. And that's where a lot of my belief comes from in this, is that we have to take advantage of the opportunities that we're given, right? We have to pay attention to these nudges that God gives us and pay attention to these things that he's doing. In this movie, if you've never watched it, there's a little boy who wants 2 hound dogs. And so he prays for them. And he complains to his grandfather that he's prayed for these hound dogs and God just hasn't given them to him. Well, his grandfather says, well, what have you done to earn these hound dogs? He said, well, if I've prayed for them, God's supposed to give them to me. Just like the person on the roof who's prayed for salvation, from this flood that's coming. Well, God sent the boat. God sent the helicopter. And the grandfather tells the grandson, well, maybe God's been giving you the opportunity to earn these hound dogs, but he's not just going to give them to you. So the child realizes that he has been passing up opportunities to work, to make money, and to be able to do things to earn these hound dogs. But he'd been praying to be able to get them. He was able to. God was providing opportunities, but he had to do his part. And to me, I think that is where most miracles occur, is where we have these chances. We have these abilities to essentially make these miracles happen. We've been provided those opportunities. We've been provided those chances, and God's timing allows that. But we have to be the ones to do our part. He's not going to do all of it for us, because if I just prayed for Jon David to get better, magically he was up tomorrow running around doing everything because we saw a hand come down and just heal him, that destroys the entire purpose of faith. At that point, we no longer have to have faith that God is real, because we saw him. It is visual. We saw it. It happened. So that is my faith. That is our testimony for Jon David. And I hope this helps you if you need an example of a miracle or need an example in your life of what God can do. And I hope that everybody continues to pray for Jon David as he continues to go through his recovery. Hope y'all have a good night, and God bless. And Jon David, tell everybody bye-bye.